In this lesson, we're going to look at rendering lists within the Vue app. If we check out the starting code, which you can access if you're following along at L5-start, we'll see that we now have this array of details. So the question now is, how do we display details as a list? So we'll create an unordered list. And on this li inside of it, we're going to add another Vue directive. This is the v4 directive. And inside this expression, we'll say detail in details, referring to the details array in our data. And in the inner HTML, we'll add an expression and say detail, so that we can print out each detail or each element from the details array. If we check this out in the browser, we can see that we're rendering our list. But how is v4 actually working? Well, as you might imagine, v4 works like a for loop. Again, on this li element, we added the v4 directive. So here in the expression, we're specifying what we want to loop over. In this case, we're looping over details. This is the collection that we're iterating over. And detail is the alias for the element at the given time of that iteration. And we're printing out each detail as we loop through. So it's kind of like v4 functions like a conveyor belt for looping over and printing out your data, taking each element from your array and rendering it out accordingly. Now that we have a better understanding of how v4 works, let's look at another example within our app. In this case, now we have a variance array, and we have an object for each variant of our product. Each product has an ID and a color. So for our next task, we're going to print out each variant color. So we'll add a div and then say v4 variant, that's the alias, in variance, the collection that we're iterating over, and then in the inner HTML, use an expression that says variant.color. So if we check this out in the browser, we should now see two divs, one with the string green, one with blue. So refreshing the browser, awesome, it works. It's worth noting here that when you're creating lists like this with v4, you're going to want to give each list item a unique key. So let's look at setting the key attribute on our div. We'll use the shorthand for vbind on the key attribute and set that equal to variant.id. This gives each DOM element a unique key so that Vue can essentially grasp onto the element and not lose track of it as things update and change within your app. This provides us some performance improvements, and also later down the line, if you're doing something like animating your elements, you'll find that the key attribute is really helpful with things like that. So that's it for this lesson on list rendering, and now for our coding challenge. Add an array of sizes to the data object, then use v4 to display them in a list. As always, you can check out the ending code at L5-end. In this lesson, we're going to look at event handling within a Vue app. If you're coding along, you can check out the L6-start branch. In that new starting code, you'll see that we now have an add cart button along with a cart. So you're probably able to guess what we're about to do in this lesson. We want to be able to click that button and add this item to the cart. So let's make that happen. Looking at the code, you can see we have this div for the cart, and it's using an expression to print out the value of cart from our data. And if we scroll down, we can find the button. We want to add the ability to be able to listen for events on this button, specifically click events. So how do we get that to happen? Well, you might not be surprised that we're going to use another Vue directive. This time, this one is called von. And we can pass this directive an argument that specifies the event we're listening for. And in the expression, this is the logic that we're triggering when that event happens. In this case, we're incrementing our cart by a value of 1. So let's check out this behavior in the browser. As we click on the button, we're incrementing the value of cart, which we can see displayed in real time. Currently, the logic inside of our v_on expression is very simple, so we could keep it in line like so. But often, we need to trigger more complex logic, so in those situations, we can add a method name to fire when that event happens. So we'll switch this out for a method that we'll write soon called add_to_cart. And down inside of our View app, just like we have a property for our data, we can add one for methods. So inside of this methods object, we'll add the add_to_cart method. Inside of this, we'll say this.cart, referring to this cart within our data, and increment the value of that cart with plus equals 1. In the browser, we're seeing the same behavior, but now it's all encapsulated within that method. Let's take a deeper look into how this event handling is working. So by adding v_on to an element, we're essentially giving it a listener or an ear that can listen for events. In this case, we've specified that we're listening for click events. And when that event happens, we want the add_to_cart method to run, which, as we just saw, takes the value of cart and increments it by 1. As you can imagine, listening for events on your elements is super common. So just like how vbind had a shorthand, v_on has a shorthand too. And it's just the @ symbol, like so. Now that we understand the basics of event handling, let's listen for another kind of event within our View app. Currently, we're printing out the variant colors green and blue. But wouldn't it be nice if when we hovered over green and blue, we triggered an update of the image to the green and blue image, respectively? So let's implement this feature where we listen for hover events on our variant divs. Because we want to update the image that we're displaying when we hover on the variant colors, I've added a new property to each variant object. Now each variant has an image path for the green and blue socks respectively. So on that div, we'll use the shorthand for v_on and say @mouseover, which is the view version of hover. And when that event happens, we want to run a method to update our image, and we'll feed that method the variant image using dot notation. Now we can add that method below and set a parameter of variant image, because inside of this method we'll say this.image and set that equal to the variant image that we just passed in. Now in the browser, when we hover over the green and blue string, we're seeing the green and blue image. And with that, we've come to the end of the lesson and to our coding challenge. Create a new button that decrements the value of cart. As always, you can check out the ending code at L6-end. In this lesson, we're going to learn about class and style binding. Let's get started. If you're coding along, you can check out the L7-start branch. In the last lesson, we added the feature where if you hover over the green and blue div, you update the variant image. But wouldn't the user experience be just a little bit nicer if instead of hovering over the word green and blue, we hovered over the actual color green and blue? So the question is, how can we show the variant colors themselves using style binding? Before we get that style binding working, however, I'm going to add a new class to this variant div. That class is going to be called colorCircle. And if we look at that class in our CSS file, we'll see that it essentially styles our div as a 50 by 50 pixeled circle. Now that the div is starting to look how we want it to, we can move on to the actual style binding, where we use the color name to set the background color of this div. So back in VS Code, I'm going to use the shorthand for vbind on this style attribute, and in the expression, I'm going to add a style object. Like I said, we're going to update the background color and set that equal to the variant color. Now looking in the browser, instead of displaying just those color names, we're displaying the actual colors. Cool, so now that that is working, let's understand on a deeper level how this is all working under the hood. On our div, we added the style attribute and bound a style object to it. That style object has the CSS property of background color, and we're setting that equal to whatever the variant color is at the time of that v4 iteration. So in the first iteration, variant.color is green. So Vue takes that information and converts it into the code style equals background color, green, and prints out the green background circle. In the next loop, variant color evaluates to blue. So Vue prints out a blue background circle. Pretty simple. There's some important things to consider when using style binding like this. So remember, we're within an object here. Inside of this expression, remember that this style object is all JavaScript. So that's why I used camel case in this property name. If I had said background-color, because we're in JavaScript, that would have been interpreted as a minus sign, but we're not doing any math here. We're setting a CSS property name. So our options are either camel cased, or alternatively, we could use kebab case, but we'd have to put that property name within quotes like so. Sometimes you might want to add a bunch of styles, but adding that all inline could get messy. So in situations like those, we could bind to an entire object that lives within our data, including all those styles within there. So in this case, when this renders, we would have added each property from the style object within our data. Back in our app, you'll notice that when our in-stock value is false, we can still add the item to the cart. But if the item is out of stock, maybe we don't even want the user to be able to add it to the cart. So let's change up the behavior here. Let's make the button disabled whenever in stock is false. To get this feature started, we'll use the shorthand for vbind on the disabled attribute and add that attribute whenever our product is not in stock. In other words, whenever in stock is false. Now, because in stock is false, the button is disabled, so when we click it, we're not running that add to cart method. But the button still looks clickable, so let's use class binding to add a disabled button class. You'll see in our CSS file that we have this disabled button class, which sets the background color to gray and makes the cursor not allowed. So we're going to use class binding to conditionally add this class whenever in stock is false. We'll use the shorthand for vbind on the class attribute and pass in an object which includes the class name that we want to add whenever our product is not in stock. Now, because in stock is false, not only is this button disabled, but it also appears to be disabled. If we pop open the dev tools real quick and say mounted app.instock and set that to true, we'll see that our button is now active and usable again. When getting started with class binding, there are some things to note. For example, what happens when we already have an existing class, such as color circle, and we wanted to conditionally add an active class based on the truthiness of active class within our data? Let's look at this example. In the class binding here, active is the class name, and active class is really a condition that we're evaluating to determine if we're adding the active class or not. So because active class in our data is true, we're going to add the class of active to this div. At this point, you might be wondering what's going to happen here because we already have the color circle class and we're adding another class, the active class. How does that look? Well, when this actually renders out, those classes are going to be combined like so. A helpful tool that class binding gives you is the ability to use inline ternary operators. So here we can use this array syntax and add the active class whenever isActive is true. Otherwise, we could add an entirely different class or none at all. In this case, because isActive is true, we are indeed adding the active class. The variations in syntax and use cases that I just showed you with class and style binding is only the start, so I do recommend checking out the Vue docs for more use cases and examples. For now, this brings us to the end of the lesson and to our coding challenge. Bind the out-of-stock image class to the image whenever in stock is false. You can find this lesson's ending code at the L7 end branch. In this lesson, we're going to learn about the concept of computed properties. Let's get started. If you're coding along, you can check out the L8 start branch, and you'll notice we have a new data property, a brand of ViewMastery. Now, what if we wanted to combine the brand and the product in our template? For example, up here in the expression within the H1, we could say brand plus a space plus product. And if we check that out in the browser, we'll see ViewMastery socks displayed. But wouldn't it be neat if our app had the ability to compute that value for us? For example, taking the brand and the product, adding them together, and returning that new value. Well, these are the kind of things that computed properties allow us to do. So now let's encapsulate this behavior inside of a computed property. So we'll cut out this logic here and replace it for the word title. This will be the name of a new computed property that we'll add below. So down here we'll add computed, then create a computed property called title, and inside of here it's going to return this.brand plus a space plus this.product. Now heading into the browser, we still see ViewMastery socks, except now that value was calculated for us by a computed property. But how exactly are computed properties working? Let's take a deeper look. I like to think of computed properties kind of like a calculator because they calculate or compute values for us. In this case, it's computing the value of brand plus a space plus product. That, of course, equals ViewMastery socks. And the benefit of computed properties is that they cache the value, so it stores it away and only updates when it needs to, when one of its dependencies change. For example, if the brand were to change from ViewMastery to NodeMastery, our computed property would receive that new dependency, then recalculate and return the new value. Looking back at our app so far, we're updating the variant image based off of which color circle we're currently hovered on. But what if each variant had a different quantity? For example, one could be in stock and the other could be out of stock. We really should be updating whether we're displaying in stock and out of stock based on the variant's quantity. So let's head into our code and make that happen. To review, when we mouse over these variant divs, we're updating the image based off of one of these image paths in our variant. And as you'll see, each variant now has a quantity, and our green socks have 50 while the blue socks have 0. In other words, the blue socks are out of stock. So let's refactor our code so we're updating the image and in stock with computed properties. When the mouse over event happens, we're now going to trigger a new method called updateVariant. And it's going to take in the index. To get access to the index, we'll pass it in as a second parameter in our v4, like so. Now, down here in our data, we're going to remove image, and instead we'll use selectedVariant. And we'll initialize it as 0, because we're going to update this with the index of the variant that's currently hovered on. We'll also delete out inStock, because again, both inStock and image are now going to be computed properties. But first, we're going to change updateImage to updateVariant, which takes in the index of the currently hovered on variant and sets this.selectedVariant equal to that index. To test to make sure this is working, we're going to console log index. If we check this out in the browser, as we hover over these variant color circles, in the console, we'll see their index is logged, 0 and 1 respectively. Also, notice we have this warning. Property image was accessed during render but is not defined on instance. So what is this referring to? Well, here is where our image is supposed to be showing, because in our template we have this image element and its source attribute is bound to image. But remember, we just deleted image from our data, hence the warning that it's not defined on the instance. And now we're going to replace image and inStock with a computed property. So back in our code, we're going to clean out this console log. And inside of computed, we'll add the image property, which returns this.variance. And we'll target the first or second one using this.selectedVariant, which again is the index. So 0 would target the first one and 1 targets the second one. Now we can simply use dot notation to grab the image of these variants. We'll do the same thing for inStock, which also returns this dot variance, targeting the selected variant, and grabbing its quantity. Checking this out in the browser, when we hover over the color circles, not only are we updating the variant image, but we're also displaying whether that variant is in stock or out of stock using its quantity. And if you're wondering how this is automatically updating for us, where the out of stock and in stock is toggling and the button is enabling and disabling, that's because in our template, we're still using in stock. Now, in stock is not a data property, it's a computed property. And with that, we've come to the end of the lesson and to our coding challenge. Add an on sale boolean to the data, then use a computed property to display the string brand plus product is on sale whenever on sale is true. To access the ending code, you can check out L8-end. In this lesson, we're going to look at components and props. In modern front-end JavaScript frameworks, components are the building blocks of an app, and that's certainly the case with Vue. You can imagine them a bit like Legos that you can plug into each other in this component hierarchy, which, when rendered, creates your application like so. Looking at this website, for example, this website may be composed of multiple components. And a given component may actually be a parent component, meaning it has child components nested within it, like so. So let's head into our application and create our first component. If you're coding along, you can check out the L9-start branch. Because our app will have multiple components, we'll create a components folder, inside of which we'll create our first component called productDisplay.js. Inside of here, we'll write app.component, and the first argument is the component name, product display in this case, and the second argument is an object to configure our component. We'll add the template property, then head into the index.html to grab all of this product-related template code. We'll leave the nav bar and the cart here because these are global. These are not component specific. Heading back into product display, we'll add the comment here, HTML. This activates the ES6 string HTML extension that we looked at in the first lesson. Notice when I paste the template code into these backticks, we get this syntax highlighting. But when I deactivate the extension, that highlighting goes away. But of course, we want that syntax highlighting, so we're going to leave that and scroll down below this template literal, where we now need to add our data, methods, and computed properties. Those still live in main.js, so we'll copy this here. And paste it into our product display component. We'll just delete cart here because we don't need each product to have its own cart. That needs to be a global thing that's separate from our product component. Now, back in main.js, we can delete the computed properties. We'll delete out the methods, but leave the option because we'll add a new method later. And we'll delete out all this product-specific data, leaving just that cart. Now we'll head into our index.html so that we can import our component. In the source here, we'll go into our components directory and grab the product display component. Now that it's imported, we can use it within our template. If we check this out in the browser, you can see all of that code is still showing up just like it was before, but now since we've rearranged things, that button is no longer adding to the cart. We'll fix that in the next lesson. For now, to show you how helpful these reusable blocks of code can be, I'm going to paste 2 more product display components And when we refresh the browser, we'll see them all showing up, each of which are independently functional. Now that we're starting to learn how to encapsulate reusable code into these components, what happens when our component needs something that is outside of itself? For example, what if the parent, so to speak, had this message data and the child needed it? Because a component has its own isolated scope, it can't reach up outside of itself to grab something that's outside of its scope. So the answer here is props. These are custom attributes for passing data into a component. They function kind of like a funnel, into which you can pass the data that component needs. Let's add the ability for our product display component to take in a prop. If our main.js had a new data property, premium, which indicated whether the user was a premium user or not, we can add a premium prop to our product display component so that it can receive that value. So we'll add the props option, specifying we're expecting a premium prop, and we can even set some prop validation, specifying that premium is of type Boolean and is required. Now that we've configured this, we can add that custom attribute onto the component where we're using it. We'll write premium, which functions like a funnel, where we can pass in that premium data that lives in main.js. And we'll use the shorthand for vbind so we can reactively receive the new value of premium as it updates. Now that our product display component is taking in the premium prop, we can make use of it within the component. So in the template, we'll add a new p tag that says shipping, and then in an expression, we'll say shipping, which is the name of a computed property we'll create now. That computed property will check if the user is premium. If so, it will return the string free. Otherwise, it will return $2.99. Checking this out in the browser, because premium is true, we're showing shipping free. Awesome, it's working. To double check, we'll change premium to false, which now triggers shipping to display $2.99. And with that, that brings us to the end of the lesson and to our coding challenge. Create a new component called product details, which receives the details through a prop called details. You can check out the ending code at L9-end. In this lesson, we're going to look at communicating events that happen within our components. When we refactored things in our last lesson, we broke this behavior. Now, because the cart does not live in our product display component, we're not able to add the product to it. To understand this problem better, let's look at the code. If you're coding along, you can check out L10-start. Because the Add to Cart button lives in the product display component, when it's clicked, it needs to update the value of cart, which lives in the main.js file. So how do we get this to happen? We already know that props are a way to pass data down into a component, but what about when something happens within that component, like a button click? How do we let other parts of our app know that that event happened? The answer is to emit that event, telling the parent that it happened. So in our product display component, instead of adding to this.cart, which doesn't exist on the product display component, we can instead say this.$emit and emit an event called add to cart. So when the button is clicked, we're emitting or bubbling up that event. But we need to be listening for that event, so we'll add a listener with add to cart, which, as you can assume, listens for the add to cart event to be emitted. And when it hears it, it can trigger another method called update cart, which lives within main.js. As it sounds, this method will update the actual cart. So let's implement this solution within our app. When the button is clicked, it triggers the Add to Cart button, which needs to emit the event. Then we'll switch that out for $emit, Add to Cart. And then we'll listen for that event on product display, triggering the update cart method, which we'll add within main.js. Now let's check this out in the browser. Great, it's working. We click the Add to Cart button, it lets the parent know the event happened, triggering the update cart method. To make our app more realistic, our cart probably shouldn't just be a number. It should be an array that has the IDs of the product that we pushed into it. So let's change things around. So we'll set cart as an array, and then push ID into the cart, which means we need to be accepting ID within this method, which we can have access to when the Add to Cart event is emitted. So here we'll add a second parameter and grab the ID, much like we're grabbing the image here. This ID is now the payload of the event that we're emitting. So when the update method is triggered, it has access to that payload ID. Now in the browser, you can see that we're adding the product ID into the cart, which is now an array. But we don't need to actually display these IDs, so let's change things up a bit. In the cart expression here, we'll add .length so that we show how many items are in the cart. And that brings us to the end of the lesson and to our coding challenge. Add a new button to product display, which removes the product from the cart. You can check out the ending code at L10-end. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to build forms with Vue. By the end of the lesson, we'll have a form here where users can add product reviews. At the beginning of this course, we learned about vbind, which creates a one-way binding from the data to the template. When working with forms, however, this one-way binding isn't enough. We also need to be binding from the template to the data, so that when a user inputs their name into an input, for example, we record and store that value in our data. vModel helps us achieve this, creating two-way data binding. That way, if our data value changes, the value in our template also changes because of this two-way binding. To see this all in action, we're going to create a new form component. You can check out the starting code at L11-start. Inside of the components directory, we'll create a new component called review form. Inside of here, we'll say app.component, pass in review form as the component name. And for this forms component, I'm going to paste in this code. Notice how we're using the ES6 string HTML at the top. And inside of our template literal, we've got three kinds of inputs: a standard input, a text area, and a select. Along with a button we'll use to submit the form. Because we want to bind these form inputs to our data, we'll add the data option and add name, review, and rating. Now we can use vModel to create a two-way binding between our template and our data. So on the name input, we'll say vModel equals name, creating a binding between these two. On the review text area, we'll say vModel equals review. And on the rating select, we'll say vModel.number equals rating. .number here is a modifier that typecasts the value as a number. In order to submit this form, we'll add a listener up here and say @submit.prevent. This is another modifier which prevents the default browser refresh and will trigger the onSubmit method. Scrolling down here, we'll add that method And on submit, we'll create a product review object containing name, which equals this.name, review equaling this.review, and rating, which equals this.rating. Now that we've created this product review, we need to send it up because we don't want the reviews to live on the form, we want the reviews to live on the product. So we'll say this.$emit and emit a review submitted event, passing along the product review as the payload. And below here, we'll clear out and reset this.name, this.review, this.rating. Now that our review form is created, we can import it within index.html. Then we'll head into product display and actually use the component, nesting it here at the bottom. Now in the browser, we can see the review form and it looks like it's working, except when we click that submit button, we're emitting the event, but we haven't listened for it anywhere. So we need to listen for the review submitted event and then add the review to the product display component. We'll add the listener here on the review form, at review submitted, and when the event happens, we'll trigger a new add review method. It's going to add reviews to our product display component. So we'll add a reviews array to the data here, then scroll down to the methods and say add review, which takes in the review that we got from that event payload and pushes it into the reviews array. Now that we've implemented the ability to add reviews, we need to be displaying those reviews. So let's create a new component to do that. That component will be called review list. It will have a prop so that it can receive the reviews, which will be of type array and required. And below, I'll paste this template. We'll add a v4 so that we can print out each review from our reviews array, including the index so that we can bind the key attribute to it. And then use expressions to create a sentence that says review.name gave this review.rating stars. In other words, Adam gave this 5 stars. We'll create a break and print out the actual text from that review. Now we can import this component inside index.html. And we'll add it within product display right above the review form. Adding that reviews prop and passing in the reviews that live on the product display component. So to, well, review, we're passing in the reviews into the review list and printing each of them out. Checking this out in the browser, we'll add a new review. Click submit, and there it is being displayed. When there's no reviews to display, we don't need to be showing the review list component, so let's fix that. So here on the review list component, we will only show this if reviews have a length. In other words, if the reviews array is empty, we will not show this component. With a refresh, it looks like it's working. And when we add a review, now it is displaying. To finish up this lesson, we're going to add some very basic form validation. So before we create a product review, we're going to check if this .name is blank, or if this .review is blank, or if this .rating is null. If any of these things are the case, we will show an alert which says review is incomplete. Please fill out every field, and then return out of the method. We'll check this out by trying to submit a review that is not fully filled out, and we'll see this alert. But of course, when we fill out every field, we're allowed to add the review. Congratulations, you've made it to the end of our Vue 3 course and completed your first step on your path to Vue mastery. I invite you to check out our library of other courses that cover all the topics you'll need to succeed as a Vue developer. For your final coding challenge of this course, add a question to the form, would you recommend this product? Record and emit the response in the form. You can check out the ending code at L11-end. In this lesson, we're going to look at communicating events that happen within our components. In this lesson, we're going to look at components and props. In this lesson, we're going to learn about the concept of computed properties. Let's get started. In this lesson, we're going to learn about class and style binding. Let's get started. If you're coding In this lesson, we're going to look at event handling within a View app. In this lesson, we're going to look at rendering lists within the View app.